and I'm going to broadcast. Okay.
Are we on? Hello, everyone. My name is Yolanda Flores-Neiman. I'm one of the editors of Presumed Incompetent II. Welcome to the book launch for Presumed Incompetent II, also edited with Gabriela Gutierrez-Imus and Carmen Gonzalez. This is hot off the press. We thank you all for being here. I understand that we have just shy of 400 participants on this launch, so we're very excited to have you all here. I want to thank Sahar for providing this venue for us with this many participants. It was very generous of her to use her opportunities for this book launch. So I really want to thank her. So for you participants, you will, we cannot see your faces. We cannot see your, we cannot hear your voices. If you have any questions, we will take Q&A at the end of the panel discussion, and Sahar will take all the questions and forward them to me and Gabriela, and then we will address as many questions as we can. The way the panel will work is each panelist will speak for about 8 to 10 minutes on the chapter on her individual chapter. She'll give highlights from her chapter and then expand on it in any way that she thinks is appropriate or is meaningful given the time since she wrote the chapter. Pretty much everybody wrote this chapter, at least the first draft about a year ago, and the final draft at least 6 months ago, probably closer to 8 months ago. So the whole meeting, so the panelist speaking will take about 1 hour and 10 minutes, and then we will go to the Q&A. So a couple of things that I just want to say. Of course, the book can be found at University of Colorado Press and Amazon. And I want to thank all these panelists for participating. And I want to say that any one of the authors of this book would have made a fantastic panelist. We selected, we were on a short timeline, so we selected authors that we had access to and people who could respond immediately and who could prepare pretty much within a couple of week notice at most. So we are hoping to have another panel, another launch of PI, possibly in August with other panelists, because I would love for you all to hear from every author, because every author was amazing. Let me also say that we had hundreds more submissions than are represented in the book, which speaks to the need for Presumed Incompetent II. They're just, it is unfortunate that this book is needed. And we're just scratching the surface. I mean, we had to turn away so many because our capacity was limited to 1 book. So with that, I'm going to ask each panelist to just briefly introduce herself, and then Gabriela will go last. And after Gabriela introduces herself, she will talk a little bit about what is new in Presumed Incompetent II, and then she will turn it over to the first panelist. So let's see, why don't you introduce yourselves in the order in which you are going to speak. So Jodi, you're first.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jodi O'Brien. I am a professor of sociology at Seattle University in Seattle. And I also direct a National Science Foundation funded program that's for the advancement of women and minoritized faculty in the professoriate. The title of my essay is, Can I Charge My Therapy to the University? Thanks.
Hi, my name is Sahar Aziz. I'm a law professor at Rutgers University Law School on the Newark campus. My research focuses on the intersection of national security and civil rights with a focus on the disproportionate impact on Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. I'm also the founding director of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, which is the first civil rights center at a U.S. law school focused on these communities, human and civil rights. And my chapter is called The Alpha Female and the Sinister Seven.
Hi, my name is Adrien Wing. I teach at the University of Iowa College of Law, where I've been for 33 years. I have a variety of titles. I'm Associate Dean of International and Comparative Law Programs. I'm the Bessie Dutton Murray Distinguished Professor of Law, and I'm the Director of the University of Iowa Center for Human Rights. My chapter is called And Still We Rise.
Good afternoon, good morning to those of you in morning time zones. My name is Meredith Clark. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Media Studies at the University of Virginia. My chapter title is Hope in a Hashtag. It's about Black women, online communities, and mental health.
All right, and I'll just say again, you heard from me already, I'm a professor of psychology at the University of North Texas, and I have 16 years of administrative experience, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later.
Hello, I'm Gabriela Gutierrez Simus, and the name of my chapter on this book is Silent Bias and Resisting Narratives of Deficit, Social Class and Poverty in the Academy. And I'm also one of the co-editors of this book. I first of all want to thank Yolanda Flores Niemann. She is first editor of this volume, and she has done a marvelous job of everything, getting us all together, being incredibly organized to work with so many people, because this has become a national phenomenon. People join us on Facebook, and everybody uses the title of our book, Presumed Incompetent. I wanted to, did everybody introduce themselves? I want to make, yes.
Excuse me, Gabriela?
Yes.
Stacey has not introduced herself. Can we before you go on,
Stacey. Okay,
Stacey, would you introduce yourself?
I was too eager.
That's okay. I just don't want to leave Stacey out.
Hi, everyone. Stacey Patton. I am a research associate at Morgan State University's Institute for Urban Research, and I am also a journalism professor at Howard University. The title of my chapter is, I have to actually look at it, Why I Clap Back Against Racist Trolls Who Attack Black Women Academics.
That's
it for now.
Sorry, Stacey, I was too eager. I've been waiting. I also want to thank my colleague, Jodi O'Brien, because she just went on and said, yes, I will do it, although she's, I know it, we're all very busy. I wanted to begin in talking, because people always ask me, why do we have a second volume? And I wanted to begin with a quote that is actually on the cover of the book by Mena Pratt-Clark, who is the Vice President for Strategic Affairs and Diversity at Virginia Tech and a friend of mine. Because I think that her quote encapsulates, for those of you who do not have the book, what this book is about and what the Presumed Incompetent movement is about. Quote, "This work is a powerful call to action and must read for chief diversity officers, deans, department heads, presidents, and provosts. Building on Presumed Incompetent 1, these are courageous and bold testimonies of racism, sexism, and bullying faced by women of color who continue to survive and thrive in spite of it all. The Academy can no longer use the excuse of not knowing or understanding the experiences of women of color. It now has a responsibility to respond, change, and eliminate these unjust and unfair barriers. Reading this work is an important step for those who consider themselves allies, advocates, and leaders who are committed to inclusive excellence. It is also essential for women of color in the academy to know that they are not alone in their experiences and journeys. I think it's so important that we focus in this book about something we rarely touch in the first one, which is the administrative aspect of it all. And I know Jodi and Yolanda Flores-Niedman are going to talk about that. And I will do a comparative in a couple of minutes. Basically, we delve deeper into social justice. We still need a third and a fourth volume to address disabilities and national health care for all. But I think that it's important that we are underlining that, for example, tenure and promotion are still issues that are going on. Institutional and structural biases are like the flu. They spread quickly and go unexamined. For example, the value of professors of color is often undervalued. We know that. And I knew that the moment I set foot in the academy. Our intangible worths, according to the Supreme Court ruling of 2016, these qualities which are incapable of objective measurement, but which make for greatness, is what is not looked at often. They are devalued often as we are devalued as opportunity hires in most American universities. For this reason, we, spent 8 years trying to bring forth the first volume of Presumed Incompetent that is now utilized across the nation by reading groups organized by professors and administrators, as well as rank and tenure committees. So I wanted to, I would have started with, you can go to Bandcamp or YouTube and find this poem of mine. It's called This Is the Moment, but we don't have time for that. I only have a few minutes. Nonetheless, you can look it up, you can listen to it. It's one of my poems. We must remember that this is the moment, and that we are the changers and doers, the ones who can change this paradigm to de-invisibilize our populations in the academy, and the agents to make the academy truly intersectionally diverse, and diverse in other ways that are inclusive of LGBTQ, of queer populations, of the other, and of course worth living, worth entering for young people of color. Now I want to talk a little bit about, have all these notes, about what is different. So why Presumed Incompetent II? Why another book? The social justice statistics for professors of color have not improved much. They're still very low, so we still need more. And when I think of this, of Presumed Incompetent I, I think of it as being a launching of a lifeboat from the Titanic. And I say that by all the women that come to me and that call me, and us, I'm sure, Carmen Gonzalez as well, and Yolanda and Angela Harris, who wrote the foreword for this book. We actually rang a bell in 2013 when the first volume came out, and it is a book that is a historical piece. Since then, there's been other books. I'm very impressed by graduate students, for example, that came up with a book, Don't Air the Dirty Laundry, Reflections of Women of Color on Graduate School by Kimberly McKee and Denise Delgado, University of Illinois Press. So we've set a precedent here. Sorry, I'm going back to my notes. And people kept asking us for a second volume, almost since the first one was published. They wanted more stories. They wanted to identify, they wanted to write, they wanted for the spirit of PI to not go away from today's world vision because it supported many women into defending and confirming their positions. I was first editor for the first one, and it was a scary time. People kept pulling their pieces, becoming administrators, so they were usually appropriated by the administration. Because we were doing so well with it. And it was important, it was a term that became identifiable by many. I wanted to mention again what is different about this book. And one of them is, one of the issues that I'll mention again and again is that the sections 4 and 5 are about resistance and solidarity and all the new terminology that has come about. There were terms like white fragility that were not being managed at the time that the first book came out. And we are normalizing, depathologizing the other. We want to evolve the notion of people of color in the academy, not as part of a less than population, but as equals. You cannot have equality if you don't have equity. And we want to have fun with it. We also want to let people know that we are having these conversations. I just wanted to mention, I have a chart somewhere that I'm not finding of the differences. So in the first volume, we did address social class in academia, which is what my chapter is about, but I'm not going to talk about that today. And we did address tenure and promotion. We're delving deeper into social class in this volume. And we are focusing on academic leadership. We, as I said, Yolanda and Jodi will talk about that. We're also in section 4 talking, and I love the titles of these sections, bullying, white fragility, and microaggressions. And section 5 is activism, resistance, and public engagement. And we attempted to have people from each of those sections. We are also going to continue having these national book launches. I look forward to your questions and also to discussing more of this. I have like 10 pages of notes, but I just wanted to underline what some of the differences are. I want to now hand the microphone, as you say, to my colleague, Jodi O'Brien, and she will be the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriela. And again, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to those of you like me who are on the West Coast. I want to start by saying what a deep honor it is to be a part of this conversation and to be a part of this book, and how grateful I am to the editors and to the rest of you as colleagues. Again, I'm a professor of sociology at Seattle University, where I've been for about 25 years, and I've served both in my faculty capacity, but also in various administrative roles. I chaired a department for more than 12 years. I've chaired the university level tenure and promotion committee for almost a decade. And I serve in various other administrative roles that have me located in the provost's office. And so I see things from a variety of perspectives. And I would say I characterize my primary orientation to my work as being completely oriented and devoted to making higher education a place where all faculty, particularly faculty who've been historically minoritized from this highly patriarchal institution, faculty of color, queer faculty, women, faculty who are not from trained and elite backgrounds and from upper and white middle class backgrounds, to a place that all of these faculty can be fully participating and fully flourishing. And that's my devotion to this work. And there are times when I think I'm making inroads. And when Gabriela asked me if I would consider contributing a chapter on the work, I was very excited to do so. And I quickly mapped out what I thought I would write about. But then when it came time to sit down and do the writing, I found that I was in a place of great desolation. I felt very disconsolate about some of the work that I was doing and about some of the work that we think we're doing when we, as Sarah Ahmed says, what are we doing to ourselves when we're doing this diversity work? And so I decided to take the occasion of the essay to do a really deep, critical, personal reflection on what is this diversity work doing to me? How am I experiencing it? Because I had a suspicion that this would resonate with many of my colleagues. Patricia Hill Collins calls this kind of work intellectual administrative activism. We're bringing our expertise and our skills and our passions to this work of trying to shift the institution. And in her excellent introduction to the book, in her foreword, Angela Harris quotes sociologist Ellen Berry, who talks about what she calls the symbolic politics of diversity. Institutions don't want to be considered racist, sexist, or homophobic. That's just not really going to work for them right now, particularly in higher education. But they also don't really have any desire to change the status quo, particularly to the extent that it's beneficial or just that it's well entrenched. And so the result is a kind of politics of both simultaneously inclusion, this sort of what I call diversity branding or diversity cottage industry work, where there's this reaching out to try to diversify demographically our institutions of higher education. But then once people are invited to the table, to immediately contain them. Or as Sarah Med calls it, it's the good guest rhetoric, that you've been invited to the table by the host, and you need to practice good manners and be the good guest, and especially be grateful that you were allowed to come to the table at all. And that if you get out of line with that, then you're seen as ungrateful and a troublemaker and somebody who often needs to be contained, sort of like a surly teenager who doesn't understand all the gifts that they're getting. Well, needless to say, you can probably tell by my tone, this work frustrates me. And when you sit at the table long enough, as long as I have, and you see your work as being translation work, trying to translate between the peoples and the groups and the communities that you feel yourself resonant with, and trying to bring the fullness of them into the institutional dynamics and institutional politics, you can begin to understand in a very, very real way what Patricia Hill Collins consistently reminds us of, which is that these are not our institutions. They weren't built for us. They weren't made for us. We are definitely interlopers. And what are we going to do with that? So my desolation came from the fact that I'm always caught between wondering if I'm a kind of savvy trickster helping to destabilize entrenched systems and shift paradigms, or some kind of naive fool being played as an institutional pawn. On my good days, I realize I'm kind of both. Liberatory work is always a place of tension. And the time when I was writing this essay, I was particularly aware that our worth in administrative circles, those of us who do make it to that table, is always instrumental. There are days in which you think you're part of the crowd, you think you're part of the gang, especially at an institution like mine, which is a Jesuit Catholic institution that really values relational engagement. And then you come to realize that you're just instrumental. You're not really in a relational engagement with these people. And that can be very hard and very difficult to find your way through. And so as I wrote the essay, which starts off with an overview of my 15 minutes of fame as a household name in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, when another Jesuit university a decade ago unceremoniously unfired me from being their new dean. And you can read about that for yourselves. But I come to that table hoping very much to try to continue this work, while also recognizing that I often do feel as if I'm losing myself in all of this work of translation. So just to sort of fast forward to where am I a year from now, and where do I find my solace and my passion? What keeps me going? I want to say a little bit about the National Science Foundation program that I direct. It's an institution-wide program housed in the Provost's office at Seattle University. It's part of the advanced program. And this is a program that originated in historically Black colleges and universities, where many of the faculty, women of color, in the STEM fields, made the point that science research is not done in isolation. You know, we have this idea of the professoriate as this person sitting at their lone table, having brilliant ideas and then writing about it and getting published in premier journals, and that's the academy. Well, it's just not how it works. And so Advance was started as a way to help recognize the, what I like to think of as flipping the paradigm, to reveal the incredible illogic of institutions that work so hard to attract quote unquote diversity candidates, only then to require them to cleave off huge chunks of who they are and what they can bring and contribute to shoehorn themselves into this very outdated, inaccurate idea of who the professoriate is. It's an outmoded model that reflects what me and my team like to call the 1950s guy with the, you know, the tweed jacket and the, what do you call them, the elbow patches. He's got both a wife and a secretary to type up his work and take care of everything for him. And the reality is that no one in academia, except a few handful of people, are doing this, but our reward structures and our recognition structures continue to hold this up as the sine qua non of faculty life. So through our work with SU Advance, what we're working to do is literally change the culture, to change institutional structure, to recognize not only what Yolanda, you talk about so well in your own essay, and all of the editors in the introduction, this kind of penalty for service, but to recognize actually that what we call service or teaching is actually the essential work of the university. It's directly related to institutional student success, and it's directly related to the recognition and value of the institution. And this is well supported in the research. Institutions that where faculty are engaged in community engagement, in public-facing scholarship, all of the work that's traditionally done mostly by women, particularly women of color, by queer folk, by faculty from diverse backgrounds. This is the work that actually makes institutions high profile and makes their students successful. And from a basic human resources model, you would think that as academics, we would figure out how to reward and count that, rather than treat it as work that's off to the side, that's the kind of handmaiden or service, the service work that doesn't really represent the institution in its full. And so my team and I have been undergoing what we take as this attempt to literally change or transform higher education in a way that not only values this research, but helps department chairs, rank and tenure evaluation committees, deans, and others to do what we call holistic faculty formation and assessment. How do you think about a faculty's full career? How do you recognize the realities of all the contributions that people are bringing to the table? And when you map this out, and we have 4 years of evidence-based, research-driven research, over 90 stories that we've been collecting from faculty, and many other informal ones, it's clear that this is the work that is sustaining higher education. And we need our institutions to catch up and to change so that they're actually recognizing, supporting, and sustaining the amazing work that all of you are doing. Just one quick example, I think I have a minute here. We were doing a focus group recently with women faculty who had been promoted to full professor just recently. And we asked them, share with us something that you love to do in your job, that you think you're very good at, that you know contributes to the success of the institution and the success of students. And they all went around and we had this lovely conversation for over 2 hours with women from all different professions, fields, sharing their contributions. And then we said, where do you put that work on your CV? No one knew. It's the kind of work, it's community engagement, it's student engagement, it's all of the quote unquote unique service work that faculty of color do to encourage and move students through the pipeline. All of this work that is tangible work that people don't even know where to put on their CVs. If you ask most women, do you have a leadership service subheading in your CV? They don't. They just put everything under this heading of service. And so we've been gathering these stories and trying to find these ways. And I just want to report that this past fall, we had a mid-evaluate, we have a multi-million-dollar foundation grant, which is a lot of money to leverage the university and its politics. And so we're trying to make as many inroads as we can. And we were visited by a team from the National Science Foundation to see how we're doing. And one of the women who summed it up at the end said, "What I love about this program is you're not doing a damn thing to change women. The entire program is about changing the institution so that women and faculty of color, queer faculty, minoritized and marginalized faculty can thrive and flourish in this institution." So I just want to end by noting that COVID-19, this absolutely unprecedented global tectonic shift, has exploded the cracks of all of these inequities into chasms that reveal the very, very deep fissures of structural and institutionalized inequities on which higher education is grounded. Right now, we're already seeing discourses emerge about people saying, well, I'm just trying to get through this until I can get back to my quote unquote real work. Our real work is right now. And faculty are showing up with ingenuity, with creativity, with tenacity, and we already know that this work is being unevenly shared by those of us who traditionally do this work in the academy, as we also try to manage many, many other challenges in our lives. The research that's emerging on this is clearly already very white and middle class and heteronormative. So the people who are seen as having challenges, for example, are people with children, but we don't talk about extended family models, care for elderly parents, care for neighbors, care for our communities, all of the various ways in which we are being challenged during these times. But what really is very clear is that we're not going back. We have an opportunity right now for a paradigm shift to truly work at holding up this amazing work that all of us are doing. My colleague, Holly Ferraro, and I'll say this as a way of concluding, who teaches, is in our School of Business and teaches in management courses. When she thinks about diversity work, she likes to ask in her own writing, and I write about this in my essay, when we think about inclusion, inclusion for what? What is it that we want to be included in? Do we want to be included in an institution of higher education that continues to traffic in these outdated, outmoded models that don't serve anybody and have actually contributed directly to the undervaluing of higher education in the public eye? Or do we want to be part of practices and policies and relations that allow all of us to flourish, that allow all of us to hold up our good work, not because it's good diversity work, but simply because it's good work. Our intelligences, our expertise, our perspectives, our excellent work, and we deserve to have these seen forward so that we can all flourish. Thank you.
All right, I think next we have Sahar.
What's wrong with you? Why are you so aggressive? Why are you so stubborn? Why are you so uncollegial, unprofessional, uncivil? How many times have we heard that question explicitly posed to us or implicitly posed to us, where there's something wrong with us and the system is just fine? And when I hear those questions that I have heard explicitly posed to me many times, sometimes in public, sometimes when someone's supposedly trying to do me a favor and take me to the side and give me some good advice, I interpret it to mean, why aren't you perpetually pleasant and smiling all the time? Why aren't you self-sacrificing? Why don't you do the work and don't complain, and do the service and don't complain? Why aren't you obedient and compliant like a good girl? Why aren't you grateful for the crumbs that we throw you? That's how I interpret those questions. And then in the subtext of the questions, for somebody like me, there tends to be questions like, well, aren't you an immigrant who should feel lucky to be in this country rather than be in your shithole country of origin? I've used that vulgarity to pay homage or to critique our president who used that term. Aren't you a woman whose priority should be your home and your children, not excelling in your career? Why are you spending all this time fighting for diversity among our student body, or fighting on behalf of African-American students who are saying that they are going to school in a toxic environment, fighting for more diversity in the faculty? Aren't you a Muslim? Oh, that explains why you were so aggressive and unsatisfied with what we do, how we do things around here. So I have an intersectional identity, like many women who are contributors to this very important book, and many who are attending this book launch. And my intersectional identities are on the level of race or ethnicity. I am of Egyptian origin, and I was born in Cairo. And many of you may know that being North African, regardless what you look like, and we come in all shades, skin colors and hair textures and facial features, because North Africa has a long history of mass international trade and migration. But on the US Census, we are white. We are legally white. And I'm also a Muslim who was raised in what I would say an average religious Muslim family. And I'm a woman. And I also have a personality type that isn't addressed a lot in the literature. And in fact, when I was researching for my chapter, I was stunned not to be able to, I wasn't able to find literature in the social psychology or sociology about the alpha female. Because I learned long ago, long before I became an academic, long before I became a lawyer, and in fact, it was the reason why I decided to be a lawyer, is that I am a type A and I am an alpha female. And that was the way that I'm wired, and there's nothing wrong with that. And there are plenty of alpha females or type A's or strong women around the world and in every culture. But what stunned me about legal academia in particular is that one of the reasons I entered the legal profession is because I had this perhaps naive belief that law was where I could be me. I could be assertive. I could be blunt. I could be a zealous advocate. And that was something I would be rewarded for as a good lawyer. And that this may be the profession where there will be more women who have my temperament, my personality type, because of the nature of the adversarial system, particularly if you do litigation. And I assume that the same applied in law schools because we were training lawyers. But it was a very disheartening and shocking realization when it was quite the opposite. What I experienced, particularly pre-tenure, and much of the experiences that undergird this chapter that I contributed is my experiences before I became tenured. So it was anxiety-ridden, to say the least. And what I found was the type of personality traits, particularly among women, but also among men, that were normal, were being passive-aggressive, duplicitous, backstabbing, and sometimes outright dishonest. And it stunned me because we, particularly in our profession, we're teaching ethics and we're teaching integrity and we're teaching honesty, because if we don't have lawyers practicing those values, there's a very far-reaching consequence on our society, and our profession will lose in any legitimacy which would affect the rule of law. And ironically, the people who behaved that way were rarely called uncivil, were rarely called unprofessional or uncollegial. And so it blew my mind that someone like me, who is very blunt, who was very open, you know, the pejorative term is confrontational, but in order to resolve things, in order to talk about things, in order to fix whatever problems we have in the institution or in the profession, that was considered unacceptable behavior. And yet it was totally okay to be duplicitous and gossipy and stab people in the back and try to sabotage people's careers in bad faith. And those people never got called that. And that was when I realized that the entire system is a sham, and I lost a lot of belief in that legitimacy, in the legitimacy of academic tenure and academic promotion and these, what I found to be just really a game. So as I was thinking about how to express this without turning into just a personal therapy session, which I think we all have our own version of, including all the attendees, I kind of put my academic brain on and said, well, how can I theorize this? Because at the same time that I was experiencing many of these challenges, and at the time I was in Texas, which let's just say there's a very strong base of support for the current president and his beliefs, and there's a lot of repetition of that type of rhetoric that I was observing and witnessing among some of my colleagues and some of my students, and certainly in broader society. But I was also speaking to other women professors, particularly women of color, at law conferences, and asking for advice, asking for mentorship, asking if, you know, did I just have this really bad luck that I ended up in this environment? Was it me? We always ask, I mean, we know that it's not always what's wrong with us, but of course they put those seeds of self-doubt. And I heard a lot of similar stories and a lot of similar experiences. And it was no coincidence that these were also women of color. Some of them did not necessarily share my racial or ethnic identity or my religious identity, but we had that common intersectional identity. So I said, okay, there's clearly a topology here. There is a pathology. And so I came up with 7 types, and I call them the Sinister 7. And I'll go into brief detail about them here, although most of it's in the chapter, but I just want to preface to say that while these Sinister 7 exist, and I think they exist in every institution, and they're not just in law schools, there are supportive colleagues, right? There are colleagues who go to bat for you. There are colleagues who really help you. And not everybody is sinister, and not everybody is malicious and duplicitous and uncivil and unprofessional by the standards that I think are legitimate. But for purposes of this book, I'm focusing on those who are impediments to one's professional development, growth, and mental wellness. So the 7 are the troll, the patriarchal female, the whispering coward, the head minority man in charge, the liberal hypocrite, the stealth pervert, and the misogynist racist. Now the troll, I think we all know what a troll is. My experience with the troll, and there were a few on my faculty, is essentially they were spies, but they tried to pretend like they weren't spies. They tried to pretend like they were indifferent, as if they didn't, so that you wouldn't be suspicious of them. But at some point you realize they were constantly coming by your office during your office hours to see if you were actually having office hours. They would ask your students about whether you were a good teacher when they weren't asking those questions about other pre-tenured people, especially if they were white males. They would check to see if your programs were actually well attended, and look and listen to see if you were going to make any mistakes and how you discussed a certain topic. And essentially what they're doing is they're gathering ammunition that they can then use during a promotion meeting, a tenure meeting, or some kind of a context where you're not there to be able to defend yourself, and you don't even know that this person's collecting this evidence against you. And all the while, this person is pretending that they're indifferent and they're not really paying attention to you. The patriarchal female, which I think is something women really need to talk more about. It's nothing new. I call it the patriarchal female. There are other terms, and this is something we need. So we all know that patriarchy cannot exist, cannot continue without us as women. We are the foot soldiers of patriarchy. We are the implementers and the enforcers of patriarchy across the globe. I see it in Egypt, I see it in the United States, I see it across class, I see it across races, and I saw it in the legal academy. And oftentimes the patriarchal female there were two challenges that I faced with regard to this type. First is she tends to be the good girl that's constantly being used to convince everyone else and you that there's something wrong with you. Because look at this person who is civil, who is collegial, who's playing by the rules, who's successful, and so there must be something wrong with you. The other thing is that she gets rewarded for playing along with gender stereotypes. And maybe maybe her behavior is authentic to her, but oftentimes these patriarchal females don't realize that even though she may be authentic, which I respect, she doesn't realize how she's being deployed to repress other women who don't fit those stereotypes and shouldn't have to fit those stereotypes. And so oftentimes she's used as the liaison or the communicator or the enforcer against other women. And this in itself is, I'm sure, a conversation in many different disciplines. The whispering coward is the person who will backstab you, who will pretend to be your friend, who you will trust, and then you will discover that they do not have the courage to tell you, maybe there's a valid critique, maybe there is something that they should tell you, and instead they will betray you. The head minority in charge head minority male in charge is a really challenging topology or type to deal with if you are a minority woman who strongly supports minority men and their success. Because what happens, and this is a typical intersectionality story, a lot of African-American women told these stories during the civil rights movement and post-civil rights movement. I just read an excellent book, an oldie but goodie, The Black Macho and the Myth of the Superwoman. We have these same versions in Arab culture and in Muslim majority societies. But the challenge there is, how do you deal with a minority male colleague who is in fact experiencing his own forms of discrimination, but is also engaging in misogyny and sexism in ways that stifle you and in ways that subordinate you? And that's a really tough situation. I found that to be the toughest situation to deal with, because I didn't want to contribute toward the systemic discrimination against African-American men, or the stereotyping of Arab men as terrorists or aggressive, or other stereotypes against other minority men. The liberal hypocrite is, in my opinion, the most common type. And this is the, this is a type that I think is really a problem in the academy, because we are supposedly this very liberal institution. Conservatives are constantly attacking the academy of all disciplines of being too liberal. To the extent that there's some truth to many academics are self-identifying as liberal, which I personally don't think is necessarily a bad thing. The problem is they don't act on those liberal values. And I've seen that many times in faculty meetings when we're talking about diversity, increasing diversity among students, when we're talking about bar passage issues that disproportionately affect minority students or women, when we're talking about employment and disparities in employment based on the identities of our students, et cetera, et cetera. And I have seen time and time again at conferences and other places where you will have professors who officially are liberal, some of them are even progressive based on what they write. But when it's time to expend their political capital and be unpopular and say things that people aren't going to want to hear at their institutions, they're silent or they're absent. And that is really disappointing. And I had to learn that the hard way, where I thought that I had allies, and I was convinced based on what they wrote, what they researched, and what they discussed with me in private. And then I found myself alone in meetings, pre-tenured, essentially fighting for certain values and beliefs, making it much easier for my detractors to attack me, right? And to discredit me, and ultimately discredit kind of the objective of why I was being disagreeable. And then finally, the last two are the stealth pervert and the misogynist racist. The misogynist racist is self-explanatory, and the stealth pervert is just acknowledging that many of us have experienced different forms of sexual harassment, and how, especially in the academy, people can be very savvy in how they hide that. And the key danger, I think, with stealth perverts is not just the harassment itself, but the retaliation that they practice when you reject them. And that can have very lethal or fatal professional consequences. So with that, I want to end, and I look forward to your questions. And thank you so much to Yolanda Flores-Niemann, Gabriela Gutierrez-Imú, and Carmen Gonzalez for editing this really important book. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we're going to go to, and I ask the panelists to watch your times. I know we have so much to say. Adrien, you're on.
Thank you very much, Yolanda. I would like to second Sahar in thanking you and also Gabriela for being co-editors, and of course a toast also to our third co-editor who's not with us, Carmen Gonzalez. I enjoyed being part of the first volume, and it was wonderful when I was asked to consider, could I write something else? To figure out what is it I could say? What is it I could say on a webinar like this at some point? What is it I could say to others who are considering becoming women of color in academia? I have been teaching 33 years, and there are not very many women of color, African-American women, who have been teaching for this length of time. And so I decided that for this narrative, and it's my fourth narrative that is focusing on autobiographical elements of my life, that I would focus on retirement, because retirement is looming for me, hopefully not imminently, but certainly in the next few years, retirement is coming. And so the title, And Still We Rise, I wanted to be an anthem of triumph, pulling from Maya Angelou's And Still I Rise. So I would have some words of wisdom that I might like to share. Everything that I wrote, and it might have been even 2 years ago almost when I was contemplating this, is of course now affected by COVID. We're in the age of COVID, and I have 10 relatives in New York City area who have either had the illness, have it now, and 2 in my extended family have died. So COVID is not a theory, COVID is a reality. So everything that I wrote when I wrote this essay is now affected by the fact that this illness is affecting people I love on a personal level, as well as everyone else is affected and will be affected in the future. So when I decided, what is it that I could say when I was writing this, I decided that I would come up with 4 different sub-themes, which I will mention here. One is love is all there is. Number 2, spirit injuries can fester until the end. Number 3, privileging multiplies. How do you handle it? And last, the struggle is my life. Love is all there is. If anything, COVID shows us it's love that matters. My God, when you go into the hospital and you don't see your loved one and they die and you don't even know where their body is, this is emphasizing that life is not some footnotes. Life is about love from people, whether it is love from your colleagues, from your family members, from others you have met, your students, that love is really all there is. And so when people say to me, how, Dean Wing, did you do everything you've done? You've done 140 publications, you've helped write 3 constitutions, you've done this, you've done that. I say it's about love. In my case, part of that love comes from my 7 children and 15 grandchildren that I have so far. And part of that love comes from my partner, James Somerville, who I've known 40 years. We're a recycled couple. We met in 1980 for 1 year, dated, broke up, recycled 16 years later. And so he's been with me in Iowa for 24 years. And nothing I have done in this past 24 years for sure could I do if James wasn't there with me to do not only the so-called traditional male tasks, but also a lot of the support of the household, which included helping with those children. He helps now with the grandchildren. So nothing could happen without him. And it's also incredible because he is bipolar. He is out as a bipolar person. And in that situation, that's a very serious disease. And now in the age of COVID, he also is someone who suffers from emphysema. So we are high risk, and he is even higher risk than me. And so needless to say, we worry, what's going to happen if one of us or both of us comes down with COVID? What if one of us passes away? Well, whatever's going to happen, we're going to be there for each other. We're going to have the support of our children, our grandchildren, our colleagues, and our friends. So whatever is going on in your life, you need to find love wherever it's going to be, and really have that, because that's what's really going to count in the end, and how people will also remember you is that love that you radiated out. The second topic, spirit injuries can fester to the end. In my work, I've been writing about something I call spirit injury, which is the isms, the racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, any ism. And when you get a lot of these spirit injuries to you, especially as a woman of color, they could add up to spirit murder. And spirit murder could be homicidal, suicidal. You could do all kinds of things to yourself to put yourself to just drown all of your miseries. Now, spirit injury, if you've been treated like a piece of crap your whole career, you can bet you're going to have that situation when it gets near retirement. And now here we have COVID, right? With, oh, we got all these old people. They don't count. We need to push them out. We need to boost the economy. You need to retire. You don't understand how you're going to do Zoom. So here's a whole nother aspect. Another aspect is what I call stature identity. Stature identity is how you look. And needless to say, most women of color have never fit the image of Barbie doll or whatever is the so-called ideal white woman, white elite woman. And so, of course, when you're near retirement, you're even further away from any image like that. People walk through you, don't think you count, want to push you aside. In my youth, I used to get a lot of sexual harassment. Needless to say, I don't get that a lot now. But the spirit injuries that I have from being sexually harassed by colleagues, by students, by international dignitaries, they still affect me even as I'm near the end of career. And also my biggest spirit injury is the fact that I'm still grappling with the fact that my father, Dr. Jodi Wing, committed suicide when I was 9 years old. And even though that's over 50 years ago, that spirit injury affects me. And until you can release your spirit injuries like that and talk about them, and it took me 50 years to even talk about this, you can't heal. Your injuries can't heal. And we know, we as women of color, we have absorbed so many painful things have happened to us that we die at younger ages. And so when I just looked at just a few of the women who have been law professors who died in their 40s or 50s or 60s, it's quite a long list. Professor Patricia Roberts Harris, a former ambassador, Golden Butcher from Howard, Marilyn Yarbrough, who was a dean, Pamela Bridgewater, 46, Hope Lewis, 54, not to mention all the other women in academia, as well as men who have died way too soon. Third topic, privileging multiplies. I know the fact that I'm this rare creature, a tenured law professor, which up to now has meant they couldn't just get rid of me. Now, as we know, with COVID, you know, all bets are off. Many universities may literally crumple. And there have been cases in the past few years where tenured people have been dismissed despite that tenure. But for me, up to now, it has been a privileging. So even though I'm a woman of color, a Black woman, I'm in this rare situation that even in the age of COVID, right now, at least up to this minute, my university has not said we're going to fire, you know, tons of tenured people. However, we know they are taking other measures at my university or others that may in the end affect lots of people. And we have to be aware of that. So what do? I'm globally privileged. I'm able to stay in my house. It has heat, it has air conditioning. I can work on articles. I have a backyard. In Iowa, we don't have that many cases overall. Our hospital is able to manage it. So for the moment, what are the kinds of things that I can do to help? Obviously, I'm helping in my broader family, including over to the people who have the illness. But also, I created a few years ago the Wing Fund, right? A fund doesn't have to be named for a dead white man. The fund can be named because you fund it or you get people to support it under whoever's name. The Wing Fund helps students, especially students of color, who would like to go abroad as either study abroad or externship. And I started that because when I went abroad in 1977 for the first time to Kenya, changed my whole life, made me focus on Africa, made me become an international lawyer. So I gave $100,000 to the Wing Fund. You say, girl, where'd you get that? It's called term life insurance. Term life insurance. Well, that means I have to die, right? No, actually it doesn't, because yeah, when I die, it'll be endowed and people will get it. But I started giving a little bit each month so that each year now, several $1,000s can be given out to help students go abroad. So you can do something like that with even $50 a month, not to mention much more. My last topic, the struggle is my life. I've specialized in South Africa in my career. Nelson Mandela, his autobiography was called The Struggle is My Life. When he said that, he was in prison. He did not know if he was ever going to get out of prison. He didn't know he was going to become the first Black president. He didn't know that he was going to get a Nobel Peace Prize. So I think we have to each judge ourselves, not with whether or not we're going to cure racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, or any ism. We are not. We are not going to cure it in our lifetime or the lifetime of any of my great-grandchildren. Instead, we will be judged by the quality of the struggle that we each waged for justice. What did we do in those years, whether we had 40-year career, 20-year career, or however long our careers are? That is how we will be judged. That is how we will make a difference. And still, we will rise. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. Meredith, you're on.
Okay, thank you. Again, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Although I am coming to you from the University of Virginia, which you can see behind me with this virtual background, I do want to acknowledge that I stand on unceded Manahoac and Monacan lands. These are territories that were in the trust of these peoples, and the university has indeed colonized this space and stands on it today. So I do want to acknowledge the folks, the indigenous folks who were here first, whose legacies we are trying to uphold as people of color in the academy. It's a very interesting thing being a Black woman at the University of Virginia. I transferred here, came here as an assistant professor in 2017. In fact, my first day on grounds, as we call it, was August 13th, 2017. That is the day after a protester in a car rammed a crowd downtown and killed one anti-fascist protester. In the summer leading up to my transition to UVA, I watched with horror as the campus was invaded by white men with torches, declaring that they would not be replaced. But somehow I felt prepared for the challenge that was ahead. Having moved through predominantly white spaces for all of my life, first as a child growing up in Lexington, Kentucky, fortunately going to an HBCU for some resilience and some support and community there, and then doing my PhD at UNC Chapel Hill, I was familiar with what it was like to be the only one. It was in my time at UNC Chapel Hill, in fact, that my colleague and cohort mate, Anassa Senegal, told me that she had found a book in our library that spoke to the experiences we were having in graduate school. Anassa and I were the only ones who could look to one another in class with the exchanged knowing look. Did that just happen? Did he just say that? Are they talking about me? And while we thought for most of that first semester that perhaps we were outside of our right minds, reading Presumed Incompetent helped us to know that we were not alone. And what we were experiencing in our graduate programs was a common experience, unfortunately, to many Black women and women of color. So it's been a privilege and an honor to be a part of this volume, to be able to contribute to a legacy of passing on knowledge, wisdom, and resources, frankly, for navigating the academy and life both inside and outside of it. My chapter is called Hope and a Hashtag, Social Media as a Source for Developing Community. And it's based out of my digital ethnographic work on Black Twitter. I've studied Black Twitter almost for 10 years now. We're coming up on the 10th anniversary of when the mainstream news media realized that Black Twitter was a thing. And I found in that time that while I was separated by thousands of miles from family members, from friends, and even detached from the area in which I had developed proficiency, and that was as a journalist, there was a place for me to have community. Twitter then is not what Twitter is now. Twitter at that time was a space where more people were coming to get away from their family members and friends on Facebook and to simply talk about their experiences, to talk freely, to talk openly, to connect with one another, and to find community. Finding community on Twitter for me meant finding a community that allowed me to identify the fact that I needed treatment for depression in graduate school. I want to just note that in graduate programs, folks who are in graduate school specifically pursuing a PhD have a much higher likelihood of developing depression than the general public. The rate of general depression or anxiety disorder among the general public is 6%. It stands at 39% for individuals who are earning a PhD. Black women are twice as likely than Black men to be diagnosed with depression. And so I was certainly not alone, but being in that apartment in Durham, North Carolina, going to school every day and being able to make a living from reading, writing, and thinking made me feel absolutely guilty about not having the energy sometimes to get up and to go to class and to participate and to be engaged. And for those questions, I didn't necessarily have any answers. I came from a pretty religious family, one who would tell me to pray about it, that I didn't necessarily need medical attention or intervention in that sort of way. It was my online community on Twitter that helped me to recognize depressive symptoms that ultimately led me to seek a diagnosis. Over time, connecting with people through hashtags like No Shame and No Shame Day, I was able to identify what was wrong in my life, get treatment, find out what therapists weren't really working for me. I'd had a basis of comparison because others talked about their experience in therapy, and then to lend similar support to other people. In fact, in the acknowledgements of my dissertation, I thank my therapist, the clinicians who worked with me, and the community that I had online for being part of my support network while pursuing the PhD. That support network remains today. I would like to note that this is also Mental Health Awareness Month, and so it is a likely time to think about how our mental health is subject to a number of assaults while we are pursuing PhDs, while we are navigating what I call the tenure track hustle, and while we are transitioning into the next phases of our life as academics. I don't have a lot to give as far as a position about what it's like to be an academic, a junior academic at this time. What I have more is an exhortation that if there is something that you have felt just wrong in your spirit or in yourself, in your soul, to take the time to think about seeking treatment, seeking help, and being able to say to someone else that I am in pain. Terry Williams, who wrote Black Pain, It Only Looks Like We're Not Hurting, gives a template for individuals who know that there is something that's not quite right in their minds, want to be right in their minds, and want to reach out and let others know that they are suffering. It's a very simple template. It says, I, and you state your name, want you to know that I am in pain. This is a hand out to someone. It can be a hand up to someone else. If you recognize that a student or a colleague, a friend, even a mentor is suffering, I do encourage you to speak up and to say something, to remind them that there is no shame in admitting that we struggle with mental illness, that we struggle with depression, anxiety, or any other of the illnesses that have been and can be diagnosed in our populations. I want you to know that you are not alone, that you can persevere, and that there is a community of people both on the other side of this screen, online, and probably in your own community, who stand willing and ready to help you. Thank you.
Thank you, Meredith. I felt warm all over when you said that. It's like, we're not alone. You're so right. So I'm going to go next because I'm going to talk about administration. And by the way, our panel is in the order in which we are in the book. And my chapter is called The Social Ecology of Tokenism in Higher Education. Some of you may know that I've been writing about tokenism for a very long time, probably since I was in graduate school. Experiencing what so many of us have, I didn't know it was tokenism when I was first experiencing it. You know, and then I realized how much it has encompassed my entire life. I went to school in San Antonio. People think, well, San Antonio, that's such a diverse city. That's, you know, how lucky you went to San Antonio. Well, I went to schools with separate drinking fountains in San Antonio, Texas. So that tells you a little bit about how old I am too. And they weren't legal, but there's a difference between de facto and de jure, right? You know, it's what's legal and what is done. And we're seeing that right now all over the place. I mean, with just my students with COVID in this community in North Texas, they weren't supposed to be evicting anybody. Well, several of my students got evicted within the first week. I mean, by the end of March, they couldn't come up with, they had been furloughed in March and they couldn't come up with their rent on April 1st, and they were evicted. I mean, one of my students was living in his car on the Walmart parking lot. And so, you know, this, it's, you know, somebody said earlier that Adrien was talking about the struggle. The struggle is the life. And tokenism has been a struggle of my life, but not just mine, all of ours. And let me just give you just the latest data, because I think it's important for us to know, how the hell are we tokenized anyway? How does this happen? You know, why do we have these feelings of anxiety? And I'm going to talk more about the consequences of tokenism. And then I'm going to talk about how they relate to administration, because I was an administrator for 16 years. So the current data, and this is the National Center for Education Statistics, which is a center that was mandated by Congress in the 1970s. And every year they have to update the data. So the most recent data, this is for all full-time faculty in degree-granting post-secondary institutions. 71% are white. 3% are Black. 5% are Hispanic. Let's see, 10% are Asian. American Indians are under 1%, so they don't even show up as a blip on these data. And then we have 1% that identify as Pacific Islander. I mean, this is academia, right? So then what about, and in terms of male and female, and I realize I'm talking in binary terms here, I apologize. That's how the literature is written. But 54% of full-time faculty in academia are males, and 46% are females. Among people of color, we're split pretty evenly between males and females. But among full professors like I am, like Adrien is, Gabrielle is, I mean, there's just so few of us. I think when I became a full professor, I think I could count 5 in the United States who were in Research 1 universities that made full professor status, because most of us end up in community colleges. And then the others who were full professors were mostly from other countries. They were Latinos, but they were from Latinos, but they were from other countries. They weren't socialized in the United States. So this tokenism stuff, the tokenism first, I have some main messages about tokenism. One is the consequences of tokenism that you're experiencing are not of your making. The context sets us up for the feelings of tokenization and the consequences. So we come into the environment as, say, I did, professor of psychology. My area of emphasis happens to be race, ethnicity, race relations, but you take the chemistry professor who comes in as, or the law professor, she comes in as a law professor. And what happens is, because there are so few of us in the environment affords us being seen by the manner in which we are distinctive in that environment. It affords us seeing, instead of seeing me as a psychology professor, instead of seeing Meredith as a journalism professor, instead of seeing Sahar as a law professor, we become the Latina, the Black, the Egyptian. And our identities become disrupted. Our professional identities that we came in with all of our enthusiasm and eagerness, and finally made it through that struggle of the graduate programs, which, yeah, we need to write a whole book on being in graduate school. But we finally made it. Now we've got this, we're experts now. We are Dr. Flores Neiman, you know. And then, you know, well, okay, well, we need you to teach the psych of race. Oh, by the way, all the school districts, they really need a role model. Could you go talk to them? The Better Business Bureau, and on and on and on. And so, and then there's a protest on campus, and the president wants you to be on the panel so he can prove that the university is not all white. So, you know, and then there's MLK Day, and oh boy, Stacey, you know, could you say a few words? You know, that would really be helpful. Never mind, Stacey, that we've never called upon you before for any damn thing, and that we've never given you a raise before, but it's MLK Day, and boy, we need you on that stage. Come on, you'll be a good team player. And that's how we become tokenized, right? So the context affords us being seen in this in the very way in which we are distinctive in the context. And the irony is that the people who are the majority are the ones who are maintaining that context. You know, they're the ones who will say, well, geez, you know, Yolanda, you came in and suddenly that's all we're talking about. All you want to talk about is there's no people of color in our department. I'm like, well, yeah. And well, none of us ever noticed that before. Why is it important to you? Well, duh. You know, if you're the dominant person, you didn't have to notice. So then they make it seem like we're crazy. You know, so what's wrong with you for noticing these things? What's wrong with you for noticing that many of your colleagues are not reporting non-white data in the field of psychology, of all fields, which, by the way, just shy of 90% of psychologists in the United States are white, in and out of academia. So good luck finding a psychologist of color. So, you know, and then, so you notice these things. And then they wonder that you get upset because one of the faculty members said to the graduate students that if you spend your life looking at differences between race and ethnicity, you're wasting your career. And gee, Yolanda, why did that upset you? You must have misinterpreted that. And then, you know, you're not part of this be nice culture where, as Sahar was saying, it's kind of it's false, you know, it's a facade. You can't be real. So when you are real and you show your intensity and your frustration, then they're afraid of you. You know, then it's perceived as anger. It's like, well, actually, I wasn't anger that I was expressing. It was intense emotion, but that wasn't anger. That was really disappointment. It was frustration, you know, and so I can't talk to you when you're angry, you know. It's like, oh, well, okay. You know, so they have white fragility and we have anger, but we're the ones that get tokenized. So one of the things that happens with this tokenization is that we become very aware that we are representing entire groups of people. We're not just representing ourselves. If we're the only person of color, we're representing all people of color. If we're the only Mexican American, that's who we're representing. If we're the only woman, well, like some of my engineering colleagues, well, that's who they're representing, is women. And so there's a burden attached to that representation. It's a deep psychological burden. So not only is your identity being shifted, you know, you are now have this burden of, man, you better be perfect. Because if you make a mistake, boy, we're never going to hire another one of those. Have you ever heard him say about a white male who was incompetent, boy, we're never going to hire another white man? Woo! no. Got by with that one. Phew, let's not do that again. But they say it about us. And so, but we're not supposed to be frustrated or angry about that, or disappointed or sad. And so this tokenism, it just embodies us. And then, if you choose to do the activism that we do in our classrooms as well and teach about race, ethnicity, you're thinking about it all the time. And another consequence of tokenism is extreme loneliness. So the representation and extreme loneliness. Now you take that into an administrative role, which I really don't want to discourage people from going into administration. There's ways of doing it being successful, but you have to go into it with eyes open. So administrative roles, you have to, the higher you go, the more distinctive you become. So these numbers that I gave, I didn't pull up the data for administration, but in Research 1 institutions, we're a smidge. So I gave the example ones of being like, take a gallon of milk or a gallon of tea, and the people of color are less than a quarter cup in that gallon. It just becomes more diluted the higher you go. So learn to protect yourselves, learn to have a community, because the other thing that I want to share with you is, don't forget that this tokenism stuff not only happens in the workplace, but for many of us, it happens with our environment too, the neighborhoods we live in. Sometimes, all the people we're exposed to are white because that's who we work with. And we don't always have opportunities to have a lot of people of color in our networks. So you need to find whether our white allies and people of color who really get it, to whom you don't have to explain why this is important. To whom you don't have to explain, as some of you may know that I filed a lawsuit against the university. And it wasn't because I was fired as senior vice provost. It was because what happened afterwards is everybody else who was fired, who reported to the provost, got a certain percentage of their salary, and I did not. So I filed a lawsuit, and talk about lonely, and you have to relive the whole thing. But one of the first things that happened to me when I was actually deposed, and it was me and my lawyer against the state of Texas, right? So was the first thing they said was, well, Yolanda, did you sign this piece of paper? And I looked at it, yes. And it was a piece of paper that said, my ethnic identity. And they said, so you signed that? I said, yes, I did. I said, well, so you're saying you're white? I said, excuse me? I said, so you're white? I said, no, I'm Mexican American. I said, well, but you signed that said that you were white. I said, but the choices that I was given by the federal law said that I had to, in order to file a law, if I wanted to file a lawsuit, I had to say white race and then ethnicity. And they were trying to hold that against me. So then there's all this craziness that is thrown on us. And so the anxiety that results, the depression that can result, the feelings of craziness, like, is this real or is it me? The essential message of the psychology of tokenism is, it's not you. Be aware of how the context is affecting you. Be aware of the affordances of the context vis-a-vis how you are treated and how you are represented in that context. Be aware and find support. And then I'd love to talk more about how to be a successful administrator, but I told everybody to watch their time, and I have to watch mine too. So it's not about you. If you're in a tokenized in fact, you should expect that if you're feeling queasy or nuts or something, go talk to somebody. And sometimes you just have to knock on wood and say, yeah, the wood is real. You're being gaslighted, right? So this is constant gaslighting. So you need to have somebody tell you, you're not crazy, Yolanda. They're doing this to you. It's the context. Meredith, Sahar, Adrien, it's not you. Find the support that you need, because tokenism is physically, and it can be physically and psychologically debilitating. You can work through it. You can be successful in any position, but not without the support and not without the acknowledgement that it's happening. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Stacey.
Hi, everybody. Spade 500 at Dr. Stacey Patton. If it wasn't for Europe, you wouldn't have modern mathematics, modern science, modern technology, modern medicine, etc. Stacey Patton at Spade 500. Without Africa, which birthed all of humanity, your ancestors would have never mutated into the whiteness you think is so superior. Larry Darrell at Dr. Stacey Patton. How could you possibly know what it feels like to be white and called a racist? Short answer, you don't know and you never will. Stacey Patton at Larry Darrell. But why would I ever want to know what that feels like? How blessedly melanated am I to have been spared such a burden? These are the two tweets that open my chapter, which is called Why I Clap Back Against Racist Trolls Who Attack Black Women Academics. So my chapter is about resistance. It begins with me describing myself as a journalist and college professor who resides at the intersection of being a scholar and an online clapback artist. That is somebody who snatches the proverbial wigs of trolls with delightful surgical precision. And I mainly do this on my Facebook page where about 60,000 people hang out. Sometimes I do it on Twitter, but Twitter is not as much fun because I don't get as much space to operate. So I write incessantly about racism, and I believe that in doing so, I should seldomly fail to puncture the ghosts that live in our daily subconscious. And doing so in very bold, unapologetic, public ways as a Black woman is deeply offensive to a lot of people because, you know, let's just be honest, they miss Mammy. People don't take too kindly to ungovernable Black women who don't know their place. And when you end up in academia or in an all-white newsroom, folks get perturbed when you don't move in silent gratefulness and serve as a demonstration project in racial inferiority. So I started thinking about online resistance a few years ago when I was an enterprise reporter for the Chronicle of Higher Education in DC. While there, I covered graduate education, faculty research, adjunct working conditions, diversity issues. I wrote about the growing number of PhDs who are on food stamps. I wrote about homeless professors, lack of diversity in upper administration, microaggressions, and so on. I was only one of 2 Black female reporters in the Chronicle's newsroom. It was so bad that we would have these diversity supplement meetings and all the editors were white. So within the first few months of me working there, they invited me, a reporter, to those editorial meetings to help them determine the, things that we would cover. And I always thought it was so ironic to sit there listening to this gaggle of all white reporters calling out these issues in higher ed, the lack of diversity here, the lack of diversity there. And I'm like, what's the white version of the pot calling the kettle black here, right? So I just sit there like, this is so ridiculous. You don't even recognize the lack of diversity here at this table. And while I was there, we had some incidents where the Chronicle got itself into some trouble. One famous case was I had written about Northwestern University's first crop of PhD students in Black Studies. I wrote this front page feature on these young people and the work that they were doing and how they were building on the longer history of Black Studies. And the Chronicle paid a white blogger to Naomi Schaefer Riley to dump on those students. And it was an ugly situation. And while I was there, I had to be quiet. I couldn't talk publicly. about what was going on within the Chronicle. And I had to just keep doing my work, but thinking in the back of my mind, like, what kind of people am I working with? You know, what kind of editors think it's okay to dump on Black graduate students? Are they not aware of the larger perception among scholars of color that exists about this particular publication? By 2015, racial tensions in America began amping up. We saw the murders of, you know, Trayvon Martin, Mike Brown, Eric Garner. There was Sandra Bland. The Black Lives Matter movement was born. Campuses everywhere were erupting in protests at this moment. So there I was at the Chronicle of Higher Education, writing a lot about, you know, white male academic problems. And I was completely bored with it. And so I really wanted to write more about race and diversity issues that were happening on campuses. I actually submitted a proposal to the editor at the time for something called the Race Box. I went in her office, I was like, yo, this will be lit. You know, everybody will be talking about the Chronicle as the go-to source to have these, you know, difficult conversations about race. This is the issue. And so I was window dressed with a meeting and told that they would think about it, but then the conversation never happened again. So they didn't understand that diversity wasn't just about having two bodies of color in a newsroom, but about actually listening to the voices and perspectives of those bodies in that space. So I was frustrated as all of this stuff was happening around the country, because as a journalist, I couldn't be out in the streets with my people fighting back. We had an ethics policy that basically says you can't participate in protests. So I thought, well, maybe if I could pitch some stories, you know, on campuses, you know, maybe out in Missouri, you know, I could report some things and then on the side say, yeah, F the police, you know, right? Sort of get away with it, do my journalistic work and a little bit of activism and be in there at the same time. But I couldn't do that. I was also frustrated that the Chronicle, the Chronicle's lack of coverage of what was going down on campuses. So I started writing elsewhere while I was a reporter at the Chronicle, most notably the Washington Post, Dame Magazine, Al Jazeera, BBC. And so my stuff on race, that I was writing about race, couldn't focus on higher education because I would be violating the ethics policy. But I wrote about, you know, all of these other things that was happening, and my stuff started going viral. And so the Chronicle started getting phone calls for people telling them to fire me, saying that I was a racist, you know, because nothing is racist to racists except people of color talking about racism, right? And so, I also started using my social media pages to sound off. I just couldn't be silent anymore. I couldn't abide by these rules of professionalism when people who look like me are dying, when I know that I could go to Whole Foods to get some goji berries and come outside and disappear, right? Or be shot or tased. I was feeling a different kind of vulnerability. Being a Black journalist, being a Black woman with a PhD, did not make me immune to these realities. As I sounded off, I started to experience a deluge of hate. And I began to clap back because I just wasn't afraid anymore of people's judgment. I kept going. So for writing and speaking publicly about race as a journalist and college professor, I got called the N-word, the C-word, the B-word, monkey, a whore, you know, all of these things. You know, I'd write something about race, make a statement on Twitter about race, and somebody would be like, whore. And I'm like, oh, that's really relevant. What a wonderful rebuttal that is. Sometimes the messages were even more personal. I know where you live. I've been told to kill myself, received death threats along with creepy phone calls, anonymous letters to my campus office. And so I started hearing similar stories from Black and brown scholars who experienced these threats and those who even lost jobs. And while this was going on, you know, their department chairs, their deans, presidents, they were silent about these issues. As I was experiencing these things at the Chronicle, they were silent. They would, any piece that I would write about race, they would turn the comment section off. So they knew how racist their readers were. The Chronicle has some racist readers, okay? Because there's a lot of racist professors in academia. And so they would turn those off, but then they would leave me open, my Twitter feed, you know, and my phone number, you know, and email up there so that these people could just leave their hatred in my box. So while at the Chronicle, we had actually reported on Black women academics who had increasingly come under fire by right-wing internet-based journalistic organizations because of the politically charged comments that they posted on social media platforms, such as Facebook and Twitter. And the content of their academic publications that deal with issues of race and inequity, you know, made them targets. Think about Zandria Robinson, Cy Grundy, Keonga Taylor, just to name a few. So these three and countless other scholars of color were being targeted by trolls, conservative blogs, and news sites like The Last Tradition, the College Fix, Campus Reform, Daily Caller, Young Cons, Breitbart News, and Fox. Some of these scholars had also been placed on that raggedy professor watch list. I don't know how many of y'all have heard of that. And so it's a list of professors who've been accused of so-called liberal bias against conservative students and for doing things like criticizing Donald Trump's policies and so on. So for many scholars of color, merely responding to the dehumanization of those slurs and attacks is deemed unprofessional and even worthy of termination. It seems to me that colleges and universities are more insulted by scholars of color standing in defense of our own and individual and collective humanity than by racist vitriol spewed onto us by these dredges of society. I'll just say I'm no longer at the Chronicle of Higher Education. My severance package precludes me from disclosing the details. But it has to do with my own attempts to defend myself in these online spaces. It was deemed unprofessional. I place my chapter in the context of larger changes that have been happening in academia. A major force in academia's ideological battles and attacks against scholars of color are these more than 100 biased and sensationalist right-leaning publications. Each of them is devoted to the same cause, which is protecting the rights of students from politically correct multiculturalism and faculty indoctrination. The editors, the student writers, their financial backers are protecting their vision of the world and preserving the narrative that white people are victims of minority rights and political correctness. These publications routinely publish stories exposing liberal biases of faculty. They often cite each other, and their stories often get picked up by faux news and friends, and then spread virally through social media, placing individual faculty members and colleges under intense pressure. Faculty endure harassing phone calls, hateful emails, tweets, cowardly threats to do harm. All of this stuff ends up spreading. The emails are sent to department chairs, deans, putting faculty members at risk for being called troublemakers or even losing their jobs. University administrators, they end up succumbing to the pressure from alumni, from donors, and even state legislators who eventually throw faculty members under the bus. The Board of Regents has been called about me numerous times for writing things in national newspapers, for going on television and making statements, and for clapping back when they end up in my email. And so when we see faculty members who speak out and they're thrown under the bus, then the rest of the faculty shut down. Including so-called allies as well. So there's this narrative shaped by conservative media that progressive universities are hostile to conservative professors and students, and that university discriminates, especially against white males, against whites, against males, against Christians, patriotic Americans, and the overall greatness of Western civilization. So they're pushing a narrative that is popular among much of white America during this period, that the tables have turned against white people who are now the biggest victims of discrimination. So it's in this climate of hate, university administrators basically sanction threats by not standing in solidarity with the faculty or condemning their attackers for a number of reasons. Some departments don't have power and are trying to survive budget cuts, while others have bought into narratives of American exceptionalism or respectability politics. More broadly, donors and legislators take precedent over the work conditions for faculty and learning environments for students, especially those of color. In addition, there tends to be a lot of blame placed on faculty who are said to be bringing the hate on themselves because of their tone, their selection of topics, and because they're being too political and not good academics. Meanwhile, there's a resounding clarion call from the humanities that academics make their work more accessible to the broader public. I used to write those boring stories all the time whenever I went to the MLA or the AHA, you know, or the graduate studies conferences. What are the
Stacey?
Okay, what are the humanities for? And so this is troubling because faculty of color who have been doing this work are often dismissed as activists. And to go public has a different set of consequences for our lives. So I'll close by saying this. A lot of times we hear people say, you know, don't feed the trolls, avoid the confrontation, take the high road. And so we're supposed to put our perspectives and our lived experiences, our anger and our fears into a box so as to not disrupt, you know, mainstream narratives. But then all that toxicity becomes biologically embedded in our bodies. It saps our emotional energy, makes us physically ill. And this is exactly what online harassment aims to achieve. And I'll close by saying this. I see clapping back as therapeutic, as humor, as resistance, as emancipatory work. And I'm not being hyperbolic when I say this. And besides, because I am a Black woman in America, my sisters and I are never right. We are never considered right. We are always told that we are wrong, that we are liars. We will always be disrespected no matter how much we perform the politics of respectability. So I'm like, screw it. Why not take advantage of the privilege of being wrong and clap back for my own sanity and chuckles and for the ancestors who couldn't?
Thank you so much. Thank you. So at this time, let me tell you, I want to let y'all know some of the comments. Before we end today, Gabriella is going to share one of her poems. That'll be at the very end. So we'll have time for one of your poems, Gabriella. So this is, I mean, why do we need presumed incompetent? So this is the first time I hear my story told through others. I'm very thankful for the opportunity. Let's see. Thank you for your words. I am being validated in ways that are long overdue. That's why we need to continue to tell our stories. We need to make, you know, the Freudian in me talks about making the unconscious conscious. We need to make the invisible visible, the stuff that they tried to hide. And as those of us who are activists, and I want to also clarify that we don't mind, or we're proud to go be representing Black people and Latino people at the high school and be role models. The problem is that then we don't get the salary increases or the promotions that the guy next door got for just staying in his lab and writing and doing. He doesn't get punished for not doing the work. We get punished for doing the work and not doing enough scholarship at the same time. So one of the questions that came up, and I'll see who wants to answer this. Oh, it is a balm to my soul to be reminded we are not alone and there are many strong siblings in the struggle. Yes. So one question is, what are strategies in especially what are strategies that we can use when people try to do divide and conquer? This isn't just in administration, but in general, when they try to divide and conquer with respect to things we're trying to promote, policies we're trying to promote, changes in with respect to institutional change, how do we tackle divide and conquer policies by the powers that be? And I'll tell you that for me, in my administrative role, I tried to find allies behind the scenes. I learned that the decisions are not made at the meeting. The decisions are made long before you get to the meeting with allies, and you say, well, you bring this up, and what do you think of this? And you do all this strategizing and politicizing behind the scenes. By the time you get to the meeting, you know who's going to say what. So that's one way. Other people want to talk about the divide and conquer stuff we experience, and how you manage it. What you recommend? Anybody else? Okay. So here's another.
Yeah. I will just say that it's important to be accessible. And I know that I've had conversations with some people who absolutely just disliked, hated me. They didn't know me at all, but they knew my infamous past, right? All these things we've heard about that I was accused of dividing the department, whatever. And I think it's so important to be accessible and to not blame those people who unfortunately are being gullible because they're being told things about you, and to realize, as the title of my forthcoming memoir is Fresh as a Lettuce. And my mother, who has a second-grade education, that was the best advice she ever gave me, because it made me be accessible. So anybody who came at me with hate, I was there answering their questions and having an incredible conversation with them. And I think a lot of times when we're attacked for no reason, we close up. But I know the fresh as a lettuce is very important. Thank you.
Okay, here's another comment. Thank you, Gabriela. So this has been therapeutic and inspiring. Like many listening have experienced what you have described, and that is why I left higher education. That is unfortunate. We heard other stories from people who had left higher education. Here's somebody who wants to know, is there room for someone to speak about the patriarchy of academic institutions and their impact on women, or willing to talk about gender always being perceived as sidelining intersectionalities? Anybody want to comment on that? Jodi.
I would bridge this together. Thanks for the question with the previous one as well about things that happen within institutions. And I think there's a couple of things I like to keep in mind for myself. One is that people in positions of institutional leadership, and particularly Zahara, I loved the liberal, who's also the hypocrite. They mean well, they're well-intentioned, but they're kind of caught up in what I call a politics of containment. And the paternalism ends up treating us, the divide and conquer operates as kind of treating us like, first of all, they make us fight for budgets. So, they give us already marginalized resources and then make us fight. And then they act as if they have to split up the fighting siblings in this very paternalistic way. And so one of the ways that we get divided and conquered is that the institution claims to be speaking for, let's say, different offices. So they'll pit the Office of Diversity and Inclusion against, another office, and they'll act as the mediator. And one of the things that I always try to keep in mind is you have to talk directly to one another, which is what Gabriela is saying, and not let the institution speak for you, because it will always be paternalistic, and there will always be an attempt to try to contain the supposed troublemaking practices. To that same end, I think that those of us who have the, sometimes it feels like not a privilege, but it is a privilege, to sit at the table of institutional leadership where we're trying to make changes, I think of it social psychologically as like our reference group. The audience in our head can become those other people, and then we can become more and more inclined to not speak up on behalf of or with the people who actually are our communities. And I think for me, it's very important to always remember that I'm never more than an instrumental guest of that table. I don't really belong to that table. And so whatever I say that for me protects my own communities and reflects my own commitments is going to be what it's going to be, because no matter, I can try to translate it, I can be diplomatic, I want to be effective, but at the end of the day, I have to remember who my communities are. Otherwise, we really are divided and conquered.
Thank you. And that cues us into this question here. I'd like for somebody to respond to this. So it says, I've heard a lot about the toll that this takes on physical and mental health. What keeps you going? What advice do you have our participants? What keeps you going?
So can I start on so the first, I wanted to address the issue of the divide and conquer just quickly, and then I'll talk about the, so I have a piece called Identity Politics is Failing Women in Legal Academia that's coming out in the Journal of Legal Education. It's on my SSRN page if you want a sneak peek. But one of the harsh realizations that I've had to confront relatively recently is that just because somebody shares your gender or shares your national origin or race or sexual orientation, et cetera, or subordinated identity, that they're going to respond to the subordination in the same way, that they're going to ally with you, that they're going to suddenly, just magically become someone you can depend on. And that is it's hard to accept, because many of us who do this work are committed to collective action, right? We understand you have to have collective action. You have to be a team. You can't do this alone. But at the same time, I realize that, it's somewhat sexist of me or tokenistic of me, or for me to assume that a woman or a minority or, people have to behave or interpret things the same way I do. And so I've come to the realization that I'm really focused on people's behavior and whether their behavior matches their ideological commitments. The ideological commitments, usually they will express, whether in private or in their writing, but the behavior is really key. And I let people know too. I say, look, I don't really care what you say because words are cheap. And you shouldn't believe anything I say. We need to watch how people behave at the faculty meetings, when the students need our help and it's going to be unpopular, when we have to upset administrators who do have power over, who control the power of the purse. And that's going to speak volumes. And sometimes those people who impress me, who I'm convinced are my allies, don't necessarily share my demographics. And sometimes they belong to the dominant group, whether they're white males or white females or et cetera. So I think that we have to disabuse ourselves of this desire, which is well-intentioned, to think of our allies as looking like us, because even though they may have similar experiences of discrimination, they just don't respond in the same way. And people who study colonialism know, all of the divide and conquer that the colonialist is with the native population. That's an old story, and it applies, in any hierarchy. With regard to the mental health question, so one thing that I do, and I know this sounds a little bit brash, is I just stopped caring what people think about me. Now, I have the privilege of being tenured, but I actually made that decision pre-tenured because I realized that these people are, in my book, they are just not legitimate. I realized that this was an entire scam. Now, I'm lucky because as a lawyer, if I didn't succeed in academia, if I didn't get tenure, I did have an alternative profession, which frankly would have paid me a lot more, which, sometimes we have to remind our colleagues of, like, really, we can make more money if we're going to stress ourselves out like this. But so I know that I have that luxury, but I think part of it is just keeping that in perspective and saying, I don't really care whether you like me or not. What I care is that if I die tomorrow, I stuck to my values, because we could be dead tomorrow. And that's actually a very real possibility with the COVID-19, but keeping that in perspective. The other is family. I think what Adrien said was really important is, whether you have children or a partner or parents or best friends that you trust, or, but I do think that you have to have people in your life who love you and who you love, and that are not connected to whatever toxicity you may be exposing yourself to, and they can really help you keep things in perspective, because the worst thing you can do is be alone. And I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges maybe for graduate students, is being able, because your entire life is in that university. And I suspect that's a lot harder than being a faculty member.
Thank you. I have another question I want y'all to respond to, but first, here's somebody else who said, can relate to all the experiences. I feel it every day in Indian academia too. So here's the question. How do we change the discussion of who we are with people who have been lied to about us, but who do not even seem to want to talk with us? Anybody want to tackle that? How do we change the discussion of who we are with people who have been lied to about us, but who do not even want to talk with us? Maybe because of the lies. Anybody want to take that one on?
Stacey would say we clap back.
Yeah.
Well, I'm trying to figure out if this is a question that relates to lies about you as an individual within a department, or lies about our humanity as groups of people.
Yeah, I don't know.
So, I think collectively, I think scholars of color in general have to stop trying to seek validation from people who are irreparably committed to dehumanizing us and seeing us as inferior. It can't be reformed. It is just deeply and permanently embedded in this spiritually dead culture, period. Stop seeking validation and resist the gaze. Do what Toni Morrison told us to do. When she says, just remove white people from the canvas. They're not there, so that you can see yourselves, so you can see your communities more clearly, and not, in this sort of tainted way. And I think as scholars, particularly those who are doing work on race, we need to invert the gaze, right? To stop writing and thinking about ourselves and our humanity from this defensive way, because it's soul sapping, because it's always going to be another thing, right? You give them the data, you give them the archival evidence, you say we're humans, and then there's always going to be something else. So we're not put on this earth to be like stuck in this like gauntlet of intellectual traps and wasting our time with these folks. We need to look inward to see how we can heal, how we can tell different stories, so we can see a different, visions for our communities, policies, all of that. So just don't waste your time. It's a futile effort. You can clap back, if you want to make fun of them, as a release, but don't get trapped in that at all.
Thank you. And I wanted to tell all participants that, we're running out of time, but one of the major themes that was inspiring to me in Presumed Incompetent II was how many people were fighting back against different kinds of things. There's a transgender person who was denied tenure because of the transition. A person who was denied tenure because the provost didn't bother to look at the timeline of when she was pregnant and was on leave. There's people from different people who've taken over their grants, and but with all of these, with all of the narratives in Presumed Incompetent II, much like in Presumed Incompetent I, we asked every author to give recommendations. So I encourage you all to if you're in one of these situations, and I get these emails random from people, I'll bet a lot of you do, because I did this book, they're in these situations. Look to some of these narratives and how did they handle it? How did they handle like the two women who talk about having to go through the tenure process while they were pregnant, and then poor, not even sure how they were going to make their bills. Somebody who was, this is another one who was told that by her department that when she got pregnant, that wasn't the kind of productivity they had in mind. Look, there's so many different examples from different racial ethnic groups here, and different members of the LGBTQ plus community. So I want to thank you all, but before I transition to Gabriela's poem, because Gabriela writes beautiful poetry, and this is one of the essences of what she does. But there are other books that are out, and some people have looked at it. I'm an editor of another one called Disparities in Academia, Accounting for the Elephant, and that's primarily about Black nurses. It's primarily about Black women in STEM fields. But I think Presumed Incompetent has opened these doors, and you know, we're making visible what our conservative white colleagues have tried to hide, and what administrators try to pretend doesn't exist, by having diversity mission statements that are empty. Some university presidents are really taking it to heart, and some provosts, but for the majority, it seems to just be a statement, because the data are not changing, as I mentioned, the data in NCES.
Yolanda, can I do a quick plug?
Uh-huh.
I just wanted to say, I don't know if you can see this, New Black Sociologists. So for all of those of you out there who have any institutional gatekeeping, which I do, power, this is opportunities to hold up good work. So this is part of a book series I edit with Routledge. This one just came out, edited by Marcus Anthony Hunter, Chair of Sociology and Black Studies at UCLA. And we've got a new one coming out soon, Black Feminist Sociology, two really amazing editors coming up. So this is just a chance for those of us who do have some footholds in the academy to really take this work and hold it up and celebrate it, and champion our colleagues, rather than, as you said, you know, trying to make them fit some kind of pre-existing, outdated norm. So thanks.
Yes. So look at each other's work. As some of the other authors of Presumed Incompetent have written books too. So look for each other's works. I mean, we're validating each other's works instead of trying to fit a paradigm that doesn't fit us. So thank you again. And we hope to do another launch in August. I want to thank the press. The press has been amazing. When I called them about Presumed Incompetent II, they didn't even make me write a proposal. They said, woohoo! So Gabriela, we'd like to hear your poem. Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to first state that the first volume is essential in addressing divide and conquer. For example, there's several, so I don't want to just talk about this volume. It's a whole community, it's a whole library. And I also wanted to thank Veronica Eldridge and her mother who are watching. She is the person who did our cover, our incredible cover that is really a piece of art. And I know the book will sell. Yes, we want to clap for them. I also wanted to just read a little. I know I have 1 minute, so I will read my poem. But before that, I want to say that I hope you all continue to coin terms and to theorize, because we still haven't yet written into the paradigm script the language that describes our experiences. Stacey knows this, right? There's all these new language coming out in Twitter. I also want to thank Meredith for talking about Twitter. I had forgotten about that. Now, Ana Inimiski, a Mexican artist, handed me her card outside the Museo de Arte Popular in Mexico City as we were sitting on a metal bench outside the museum. And the image spoke to me, and I wanted to mention that today as I close. On it was a painting of a woman weaving her own tongue, weaving her own tongue. I hope we can get that image, or I hope I can get it to you. I could not get it today. So this woman, in our movements, we are still formulating the terms that describe our experiences. We must still continue to coin the terms that weave our tongues and that weave our intangible worths into the mainstream paradigm as contributing entities. And this is what PI1 and PI2 do for all of us, because we are invaluable entities, and we all have intangible words. And this is what, because we're dealing with coronavirus right now, but just in general, the name of my poem is Victory Gardens, which is what I consider all of us, Victory Gardens. The victory is within ourselves, a pearl growing inside our clammy waters, our compost, our disposable boxes, mean words from within, grow problems we turn into gems. We germinate the seedlings of culture within us. The gold is grandma's proverb, the nourishment mother's words, or not mother. The other mother who did love us deeply, the fertilizer, the laughter of our children and folks who know we are the victory gardens. Thank you so much. Thank you, Yolanda. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all. And again, and thank you so
all.
much.
I love you, love you, love you. I'm glad I have a lot more friends now. And I'm so happy to see all of you and your spirit. And that's what we see with Zoom. I know a lot of people don't like it, but I love to see all of you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you.